So today I'll be talking to you about a usability study project that I assisted in earlier this year, and it was about a mobile health app to support self-management of anxiety and depression in African American women. So as per the agenda, first I'll give you a brief background of why this research was important, and then I'll move on to what a usability study is, and then I'll move on to the methodology behind this whole research, the data we collected, the results we got, and finally the discussion and recommendations. So first with the background, currently compared to the general population, African American women tend to suffer higher rates of mental illness. The percentage is usually, I think it's like 18 versus 21%. And their mental health service use is also quite low compared to white women. 10.3 versus 21.5%. And we know that a survey conducted last year showed that 81% of US adults actually own a smartphone and they have apps installed inside. And currently on the App Store, we have about more than 300,000 mobile health apps, and about 10,000 of them are mental health related. So it's important for apps to be tested effectively before being posted on the App Store because we see a lot of times these apps are being posted without any user experience embedded into it or user testing experience. So a 2016 study published showed that about 11 apps that was studied, only 43% of the tasks were able to be completed by users. And that study showed that basically these apps were harder to use by lower income users. And the coordinator of that study himself said that some of the tasks were hard to complete. So it's really important that usability studies are conducted on crucial apps, such as mental health apps, before they're actually posted up on the app stores. So when it comes to the internship objective is basically to evaluate a prototype mobile health app designed to help African American women to self-manage their anxiety and depression. And I'd like to personally thank Dr. Tarika McCall, who was the PI on this project and really helped me in trying to understand how usability study is conducted and essentially guide me through all the results and data analysis. And also Dr. Saif, who kind of introduced me to this project in the first place and helped us understand how this new eye tracking technology software works. So what is a usability study? These are essentially methodologies for establishing the ease of use for a system. And it's a subfield of a human-computer interface. And it usually has three purposes. The first being the effectiveness. So you're trying to see how well a person can complete a task fully. And then you have your efficiency, which has to do with how long it takes for them to complete a task and if they need any trial and error to do it. And then finally, you have the satisfaction, which is more of a subjective measure that can be measured through questionnaires or cognitive walkthrough. In this research, we used three main methods for conducting the usability study. The first being the Tobii eye tracking technology. This expensive piece of equipment allowed us to create visual heat maps off the mobile app screen to gauge the user's eye movements, and also it allows us to record the number of taps and time taken to complete each task. Secondly, we had a questionnaire that we asked them to fill out post study, and I'll go into detail on that a bit later. And then finally, we had them do a think aloud method. This is essentially asking users to verbally think aloud what they're doing while they're completing each task. In terms of the methodology, first there was a prototype mHealth app created prior to my joining the research. And then we have the recruitment phase, the procedure of the actual study, and then we get the results, analysis, and then make recommendations. So what you see here is a basic home screen of the app itself, and it's called Therapy Link. And this was actually developed by a multidisciplinary team at UNC, and it was built through literature reviews, a survey of the current mental health apps that exist in the App Store, and also from expertise from people with psychology and human-computer interface backgrounds. And some of the features that it contained were stuff like thought journals, self-care plans, mood tracking graphs, but most importantly, therapy for Black girls therapist directory. It was kind of a link embedded into the app, so it would help users find a therapist. So now I'll move on to the scenarios that were created by Dr. McCall that were essentially given to the users to complete. So each scenario had a persona, and they had 4 main big tasks. And so what you see here is the task and scenario focusing on the anxiety portion of the app. So we have 8 participants following this scenario. So the first being, having them opening up the graphs feature and report the latest level of anxiety. Second task being um, asking them to find tips on how to manage anxiety through the app features, and then entering a journal entry, and finally locating a certain therapist. And then you have scenario 2. We have 7 participants in that, and this is focused on the depression feature of the app. And the tasks are very similar, except for the third one, which asks the users to create a self-care plan. So for the recruitment, we finally recruited 15 women who identified as African American, and they were all aged 18 and older. And some of the methods that we used to recruit were posting flyers around campus and in the Chapel Hill, Durham area, so like in libraries or coffee shops. And also there was a listing on recruitment for me at UNC, and they were given a $25 Amazon gift card as an incentive. So in terms of the actual procedure of the study, first, the appointment times were set for the study, and this was conducted in the UNC School of Nursing Biobehavioral Lab. And once they came in, we informed the participant about the study and the duration, and basically gave them informed consent. And then once they accepted, we helped them calibrate the 2B eyeglasses and introduce them to what data it basically collects. And then Dr. McCall was responsible for presenting the scenarios and tasks and personas to the users, while I was personally responsible for making sure that the user was always facing the phone. And so basically the camera on the glasses was always facing the phone through a tablet that I was watching through. And finally, once the study was completed and they completed the tasks, they were given a questionnaire to fill out. So I'll talk to you about the data collection in this research. So first we have the baseline data or the benchmark data. And this is essentially the minimum amount of taps or time someone could possibly need to complete each task. And so as you can see here, tasks 1, 2, and 4 don't take that many taps or time to complete, but 3 does take 15 taps, and that's because you're entering a new journal entry, and so you're typing in a lot of things. Similarly, for scenario 2, the number of taps and time taken to complete each task, so the minimum time, is about the same too. So with regards to the questionnaire for user interface satisfaction, it consists of 5 domains, and each domain has a rating of 0 to 9. So there's about 5 to 6 questions in each domain. So first domain is the overall reaction. So it'll be asking you questions about if the app was frustrating or easy to use. And then you have the screen domain, which is kind of asking them about the layout of information on the screen, if it's in appropriate places. Then you have terminology that asks about how complex the terms might be. And then you have learning, which is how easy it was for them to learn the app and adapt to it through trial and error. And then finally is the system capabilities, and that's more to do with the speed of the app. And there's also a qualitative section in that questionnaire, which talks about the positive and negative aspects that we asked users to fill out. And they were asked to fill out NA for any questions that weren't relevant to the app itself. So in terms of the quantitative analysis that were conducted, there was statistics done from the survey data. So we calculating the mean and the range of the scores so we can aggregate all the data for each domain. And then the video walkthrough analysis kind of showed us the number of taps and time taken to complete each task. And then we could compare it to the benchmark data that we had. And in terms of the qualitative data, you have the positive and negative aspects from the questionnaire that we asked users to fill out, and also the heat maps that we're going to create. So now I'll talk to you about the results of the study. So with regards to the video walkthrough analysis for scenario 1, we can see the top table shows us the benchmark data for the time taken to complete the task and also the number of taps. And the bottom table is kind of showing the average and the range for the users. So you have 8 users in scenario 1. And so we can see for task 1, the number of taps for average number of taps and the benchmark kind of meet. And so we know that people aren't really finding that much trouble completing that task. But the ones highlighted in red are the ones that we're going to focus on. So the second task asks them to find tips on how to manage anxiety through the information feature on the app. And I'll discuss why one participant actually took 37 taps to complete this task when it could have been done in 6. And then you have task 4 that asks users to find a therapist using the therapist locator in the app. And also I'll explain why some people had trouble with that task through further analysis. So now I'll dive deeper into that further analysis. So the first thing that we found through our observations of actually going through the videos of the users completing the tasks was that they had confusion between the info feature of the app. So as you can see, the circle feature is the info that kind of has information about depression and anxiety, but users were confused and they thought that this info feature was actually information about the app. So they kind of jumped around into other features before reverting back to the info feature and realizing that that is the one they needed to go in the first place. Secondly, with the graph feature, about 3 participants tried tapping on the graph because we asked them to report the latest anxiety level. And so perhaps it was too small for them to read, so they tried tapping on the graph, and I tried zooming on the graph, which didn't work. One actually rotated their phone landscape, which worked because it kind of um, zoomed into the graph because the graph took the whole screen space in a landscape orientation. And then finally, 2 participants had difficulty using the search function in this therapist directory. So one button in the app kind of leads them into it's basically an external link that leads them to this web page for therapy for Black girls. And this mobile web page isn't really mobile friendly and it's clunky to use. And there were some difficulties for some participants actually using the search function to find a certain therapist. So now I'll move on to the video analysis of scenario 2, which had to do with the depression feature of the app. And again, we can see task 1, people didn't really find any trouble finding their graph level, graph or finding the graph feature. Again, we had some problems in task 2, finding tips on how to manage depression through the information feature. And that was also because of that information feature trouble I mentioned in the previous slide. And then we have task 3. They had to create a self-clear plan. Some people had trouble with that, and I'll go into that into detail in the next slide. Task 4, again, we have the therapist locator. Some people had trouble using the actual web page. So firstly, to do with the self-clear plan, 2 out of 7 participants accidentally pressed add, thinking that they were going to add. So in this task, we kind of asked them to add activities in those text boxes. And so they would click add and it would create another 4th blank field. And they would try to delete it, but there was no option. So that they would have to close this feature and then go back into it and redo it. Although the 4th blank field did not affect the final results, but it was something that kind of annoyed the users. And then we have the graph feature here again in depression checkup that one participant tried to actually zoom in on the graph, which didn't work. And then finally, participants had trouble with the info feature in this scenario and also using the therapist feature. So now I'll move on to the heat maps. So these heat maps were created using the Tobii eye tracking software. And what you see here is basically an aggregated version of all 8 participants in this scenario using this screen and completing this task. So we asked users to report their most recent level of anxiety. And so you can see on the screen where users are mainly focusing on, they're looking mainly on the axes, on the y and x axes in the middle of the graph to kind of judge where the most recent anxiety level would be. But there's also a lot of gaze points on the bottom half of the screen. So in terms of efficiency, it's not the best. They're also spending a lot of time staring at a blank part of the screen. Similarly, this is to do with the depression checkup for the graph feature. We see people analyzing the graph, but also there's a lot of gaze points on the bottom half of the screen. Here is a journal entry summary that they had to do. And so you can see here the heat signatures are mainly in places where there's bold words and where there's like a blue button that says save. So this kind of tells us that they're mainly looking at the middle and left side of the screen mainly. So this is a box and whisker plot of the questionnaire for scenario one that the users filled out. So just by looking at this analysis, we can see that users rated the learning and app capabilities the highest, but there was a range of scores from about 5.5 to 9 for the overall reaction screen and the terminology used in the app. So in terms of the qualitative aspects of the questionnaires, uh, the main positive aspects were that people found that the interface was fairly easy to use. There was a lot of features available for them to use, such as mood tracking, a self-care plan, and also the therapist finding feature. But some of the negative aspects that people reported in scenario one were the lack of visuals and color. They had trouble finding certain features, and there was a lot of lack of intuitiveness in the graph feature that was reported a lot. Now we move on to the questionnaire analysis for scenario two. Again, we can see here people rated their learning and app capabilities almost fairly the highest compared to the overall reaction and screen. And we can see that in the positive and negative aspects again, the positive are very similar to scenario one in the fact that people found the interface easy to use and there were a variety of features. But negative aspects were lack of visuals and color. One user mentioned that there was a harsh white background that didn't appeal to them as much. And it was also hard to move back pages due to a lack of prominent home button. So there wasn't a button saying that this is how you go back. So either users would have to click the back button on the bottom of the screen or use the hamburger icon on the top left. And also we have the lack of intuitiveness in the graph feature. So to summarize, mostly users were satisfied with the app with regards to the source resources and app capabilities that it offered. The heat maps kind of showed participants mainly looking at the left and middle side of the screen, and so they're looking at bolded words mainly and anything in color. And we saw that in the video walkthrough analysis, users took a lot more time to complete a task when compared to the benchmark data. And this might be due to the typing speed or using different methods to go back and forth between pages. So some of the recommendations that I came up with were to first obviously relabel that info feature. A lot of participants had problems understanding what that feature was meant for. And then increasing spacing between buttons on screens. So during the observations and analysis, we found that users were accidentally clicking on the wrong feature because the buttons were so close to each other. And obviously, since this is a prototype app, this app wasn't as visually appealing, but that's something to consider moving forward. And through the heat maps, putting important information on the middle and left side of the screen will make ensure that users always greeted with the most important information first. And to revamp the graph feature, so make it more intuitive, such as being able to tap or zoom in, and perhaps just making the graph landscape as it is, so that you don't have that bottom blank screen all the time. And finally, this is more of an optional thing. It's not something that the development team has control over, but the therapy for Black Girls Directory wasn't as mobile friendly. So perhaps maybe finding another mobile friendly website or talking to the authors of that website might be something to consider for the team. And there's one other thing that I kind of noticed through the observations of the analysis, of the video analysis, and that's, I'm going to go through that right now. So let's say you start on screen one and a person wants to click on the info feature. They are led to screen two, and that's where you have a find a therapist button that they can click on, and that leads them to screen three. Now, if the user wants to go back to the home screen, they can click on the hamburger icon on the top left, and that leads them to screen four. And now if the user wants to go back into the info feature, we see that they're led back to screen three instead of screen two. I personally feel that if users aren't informed of the app or they don't know the app or they're new to it, they might forget that this whole screen two exists in this info feature. and so they might forget about important features that it might have. So perhaps one feature would be to not have it remember what last screen that you left from, but rather deliver from screen 4 to screen 2. Some of the challenges we faced were that, just because COVID and quarantine started, having to analyze and collaborate data, we had to do it virtually. Thankfully, we were able to complete all the usability studies right before quarantine hit, so that wasn't much of a problem. Also, the nursing lab itself had the software, the Toby software to complete the heat maps, but we weren't able to go in, so we kind of had to download the 30-day trials of Toby to complete it at home within that time limit. And also, one other thing was kind of having to juggle around with phone glare. So the glasses that you wear, they have a camera on top of them, and when I'm watching it through the tablet or their view, what they're looking at, you can see the phone, but you kind of realize once you actually transport that to the app software itself, you can see there's a lot of phone glare. So in this image, you can somewhat see the graph, but there were some images of or some videos where the phone screen was not visible at all, just because there was a lot of glare from light. So that's something that we had to like work around with. In terms of limitations of the study, there was obviously a small sample size, 15 participants, so it's not really representative of the national population of African American women. 80% of them had a bachelor's degree, which meant that there's a lot of underserved users that don't have a degree, and their educational experience might affect the usability of this app. And finally, this study focused on the usability and on the efficacy, and that might be a whole other study trying to judge if this app actually helps African American women with dealing with their anxiety and depression. And finally, we have the lessons learned. So one of the first things that I learned was obviously real world applications of a usability study. That's something I'd never done before. And also human-based research, process of like giving informed consent to users and working with human users in research. And so that's something I got experience in. And also, learning about the usefulness of that Tobii eye tracking glasses and technology and the capabilities it has to do a whole lot of other things rather than just the heat maps. And with regards to the coursework, I took a coursework in INLS 725, and we were actually told to conduct a usability study. And the skills that I learned in this research were actually applicable to the usability project that I conducted with another partner in that class. And with the literature review that was conducted in this research, I gained a lot of knowledge about the mental health apps that exist right now, and also how to best design a mental health app. And specifically with INLS 620, there was a final project that we had to do. And so one of the topics that I picked was actually mHealth interventions. And that was due to this research and my interest in wanting to learn more about different interventions in mobile health apps. And finally, I worked on creating the manuscript with Dr. McCall and Dr. Saif and others. And that publication is kind of under review right now. These are my references, and thank you for listening. Any questions?